pleasure to be here. It's just lovely to be with people in person instead of online. So frustrating online. And so I welcome everybody. I know there's other people coming. And I really want to encourage you today for it to be a two-way discussion, because I was really thinking about what to say when I came, because I've actually been at the Guru, which is a group which is a bit newer, and we're doing prophecy and Daniel. And I thought, what should I do for Nairobi? Because there's a lot of people here who've been here a long time. And I could just do prophecy, traditional prophecy, and we may have some questions about that in the afternoon. But I feel that I really want to get to know people, and I really want to hear what you're saying, because I want to hear the feeling here. How's everybody doing practically? How is your walk with God? And you know that our message is equality, that it is about relationships. And the relationships are on several levels, so I want to tackle the subject of courtship and marriage today. And I know that there are young people here who are at that stage of life. There are other people who are perhaps a bit older, are not married or already married, but I want us to see it holistically and say, okay, this doesn't just apply to courtship and marriage, it applies to all relationships. The principles are similar, and every relationship we have should be structured around equality. And even if you're not in that situation, you know people that are, and we need to know how to counsel and help each other. So I thought it was profitable to do that, and I want to hear what people are saying about it so we can address the needs of individuals. And if you've got any personal questions or anything that you want to talk to me about, please approach me in the breaks. And I'm here in Nairobi tomorrow, so if anyone wants to come to Gladys's house to speak with me, they can, or even on the phone. So I just want to know that I'm available. And even when I'm not here, I've always got WhatsApp, and I do try to respond fairly quickly. And if I don't respond fairly quickly, just remind me, because it might get overlooked. So let's open with a word of prayer. Our dear loving God, we thank you for the real privilege of being together in person. We know there are many people in this movement who are scattered throughout the earth and are often worshipping Sabbath on their own or with just 2 or 3 via the internet. We do thank you for the internet and for the people that will see this online as well. But we are really grateful for the privilege of being able to speak to each other face to face. We know that this is the desire of your heart, that one day we will sit down with you face to face. And we are sure that you want that more than we even want it. We pray that you would help us to be ready for that day, that you would inspire and encourage us to press together as we see the day approach. We pray now for your Holy Spirit to guide and direct us as we discuss these important topics. In Jesus' name. Amen. I want to start with a quote from FE 500. So it's Fundamentals of Christian Education, 500, and I think it's point 2. Yeah, point 2. So we'll just talk a little bit about this paragraph. Just read it. Great care should be taken by Christian youth in the formation of friendships and in the choice of companions. Take heed lest what you now think to be pure gold turns out to be base metal. So she's warning the youth, young people, to choose their friendships wisely. And friendships is one of the few relationships that you can actually choose. Although sometimes that's debatable as well, because my children are still at school, and when you get put in school, you get put in a class, you get to sit next to someone, and often you're thrown into a situation where you are forced to be friends with certain people because of association. But as you get older, you can choose your friends. And it says here that not just the choice of friends, but the choice of a companion. And obviously that's another relationship we can choose. So these two are really important to know how to choose. And that's what Ellen White's addressing us and saying you should take great care in how you choose. Take heed. Worldly associations tend to place obstructions in the way of your service to God. So she says, worldly associations tend to place obstructions in the way of your service to God. So what's she saying by that? And do you agree with that? And why wouldn't we agree with it? Just think about that. We'll come back to that question in a minute. And many souls are ruined by unhappy unions, either business or matrimonial, so either business or marriage, with those who can never elevate or ennoble. Never should God's people venture on forbidden ground. Marriage between believers and unbelievers is forbidden by God. So, let's put that one down. Marriage between believers and unbelievers is forbidden. By God. But too often the unconverted heart follows its own desires, and marriages unsanctioned by God are formed. Because of this, many men and women are without hope and without God in the world. Their noble aspirations are dead. By a chain of circumstances, they are held in Satan's net. Those who are ruled by passion and impulse will have a bitter harvest to reap in this life, and their course may result in the loss of their souls. So, let's think about what we think about that now in the movement. We've been through a process of growth in the movement. We know that we've gone through some changes. So we started out as very conservative Christians, and we have a set of baptismal vows which we follow in order to, for us to know what we're saying as a movement and for us to commit to if we want to. And in those vows we have some reform vows, we have some, lifestyle vows, and connected to our way of living, connected to recreation, what we do at that time, how we eat, how we dress, etc. And then we learned through Elder Tess's Vespers classes that we're not perhaps conservative right in our political thinking, we move more to the left. And then we found a balance in the middle and we have to sift our sources. But in that process, I think the movement started talking about those vows and saying these are good advice, for instance. And many people, I think, perhaps didn't agree on how we see that now, or how we see marriage, how we see relationships, how we see how we live. And I wanted us to have that discussion. So the first question I wanted to ask is, do worldly associations place obstructions in the way of your service to God? So first of all, what is an obstruction? Is that positive or negative? Negative. So when you're on the road and there's a roadblock, it's frustrating, you can't go on your journey, you can't move forward. So it's another word in scripture would be a stumbling block. This is a stumbling block. So, and what's called worldly association? How do we see that? What is a worldly association? Because we live in this world, everything's in the world, we associate daily with everything in the world. What is a worldly association in this context? Linda?
So I think it's anything that is not as your religion or your religious beliefs.
So it's anything that's
Separate from your religion. So
it's anything that's separate to religion that goes against your beliefs.
no, just religion and then there's the world.
Okay, so there's two groups, there's religion and there's the world. I guess on a global level we might say church state. So there's associations that we have in church or on a religious level, and associations that we have in church or a secular level. So perhaps we could say secular associations tend, now she does say tend to place obstruction, she says it doesn't always, and I think before, as conservatives, we were quite isolationist, so we would homeschool our children, we would be afraid to go anywhere where worldly people, secular people congregated. So we wouldn't go in a bar, for instance, or we wouldn't go to, I don't know, perhaps a family gathering of unbelievers. We'd be more reticent to have those contacts because we're afraid of what we're afraid of, that it's going to do damage to our service to God. So that in some way, there's an element of contamination. But the conflict with that is it's your choice what you do and how you associate. And nobody can actually make you do things or change your behaviour unless you allow it. So this worldly associations tend to place obstructions. Why do we think that tends to happen? So you're a strong Christian, you might go into a bar. Why do you think that would actually damage you? Before, think back perhaps before, why would we go in those places? Cameron, what do you think? Why wouldn't you go in those places before? Why would you go to them? I mean, you might have, I don't know if everybody followed it, but assuming that you thought we shouldn't. And there might be more than one reason.
I'm thinking, so maybe when just say, we felt that our interaction with those people would have an impact, a negative impact on us. So I think that's the main reason as to why.
So the influence of those people, what they say, how they so if you go to a bar, you're drinking alcohol. There might be pressure then to drink the alcohol, but even if you don't, they might be entering into conversations that we don't want to talk about, like talking about people. There's things that they do which would impact your life, I guess. And the danger is that that's then going to be a problem with your spiritual life, so it will detract from it. So if somebody had a bent towards alcohol, they went to a bar with some people that drink alcohol, and they don't want to drink it, but as the night goes on, there's more pressure, there's more, you relax more, perhaps not in a Christian environment, and that tends to make you pull down your guard, and then you might be in danger of drinking the alcohol, and it's a stress. I think it's the fear of sin. We're afraid that we might sin against God, and we don't want to have that association anymore. So she warns against that. But since then, we have kind of opened our worldview and said we need to have association in some ways with people in the world. We need to read the newspapers. We need to know what's going on. We need to see the wickedness, I guess, of inequality in the world. And that puts pressure on our Christianity for the same reasons that this says, because it can make you have obstructions. So people could be wrestling with all the evil they see. We have to keep looking at it. We're looking at what Trump's doing. We're looking at what domestic abuse. So back in the UK, I do counselling, and one of the agencies I work for is domestic abuse. And some of these stories you hear, you think, why does God let this happen? You know, and that's the whole age-old question about suffering. Why do we have to look at this and hear about it? And I know a book was recommended to, I think it was the men to read, but the women as well, about women being used as weapons in war. And our body's their battlefield. I don't know if anybody's looked at that book, but I started reading it, and I can't even carry on reading this because it puts such images in your head that you can't sleep at night or you stress over it. And so that whole association with, I guess, secular, not just secular things, but sinful things. So there's a distinction between secular things and sinful things. So just because it's secular doesn't make it sinful. And I think that's what we've just put it into two camps, and it's more complex than that. So before it was like everything's secular, cannot be of God, and these people cannot be of God, and we made a distance between ourselves. And now we're coming close to them, recognizing more about equality, that everyone's in the image of God, and that there is that need to break down those barriers between us and the world in order to reach people, and in order for us to accept them mentally. Because that worldview of thinking these things are sin meant that we judge people. And when we met them, they know that. So they know that we don't want to eat with them. They know that we don't like what they're doing, we disapprove. And the fact that we are more relaxed about it is for our benefit to be able to love our neighbour, I think. And I think many of us have perhaps taken that and said, it's okay to do all these things now. And it's kind of like we go from one extreme to another instead of recognizing why have we been told to do this? What's the purpose of this? Because before we had a lot of prejudice and we were nasty often as conservatives. And not intending to be, we'd say, oh, we love people. But because our view said God says this is wrong, this is evil, then we can't have anything to do with it. So it's important to recognize that we're meant to have worldly associations in that sense. Not in the way she's perhaps referring to it, but the way we've interpreted it is that we can't do any of that. So, but she's warning when you want to find a partner that you've got to be careful, because if they've got a different worldview, they're going to be a stumbling block to you and make it more difficult for you to serve God, and ultimately you could lose your soul. So let's. So have people found this? Do people know anyone who's in a marriage or got married and knows that it's just not working because they're not the same level? Or you might be in a marriage yourself where you were married to another role, someone who doesn't believe the way you do, and you see that people lose their way over it. Do people know people in that situation? So you can see from your own experience or testimony that this is a bad idea. And have people been ruined by it? So you might not see that ruin now. So some people, they might be getting married in the church, and they're staying in the church, and they're going to church, but they're not really on the same page. Or there may be someone you know who's married to an unbeliever, and they seem quite happy. Or there might be someone in the movement who's married someone outside the movement, and they looks like it's working. But no one knows how it's going to go down the line, and how the tests and the trials that come up in that situation. I think that's important to bear in mind. So it says then, marriage between believers and unbelievers is forbidden by God. Do we still believe that? Who still believes that? Put your hand up if you still believe that. So anyone who doesn't believe that, does anyone not believe that? I don't pick on anyone. So anyone who doesn't believe that, why don't you?
Yes. So it's not about like not believing, but I think for me it's more of us refining what believer is. So initially it was people in the Adventist movement, Adventist church. So yeah, conversation about what a believer is. There's a believer in terms of worldview, believer in terms of like principles of equality, or a believer in terms of
So that's a good point. It's a good point that it depends on how you define believer or unbeliever. And I think we may have changed how we see that. I don't know. What is unbeliever? And so Eddie said before, we used to see, how would you define an unbeliever before? Someone who wasn't an Adventist. So so going with that definition, are most of you raised in the Adventist church? Is anyone not raised in the Adventist church? Let's come to this from Eddie hasn't. And Sabina. So most people have been raised in the Adventist church or have contact with the Adventist church. So when you had that view, did you think that meant you could marry anyone inside the Adventist church? Is that how you saw it? Yeah? Yeah. So in your own head, you didn't feel that there was levels of spirituality and it still wouldn't be okay to marry anyone. But you just think it's okay because they believe the same doctrines I do on one level. But in your experience, have you been in the church and seen that some people are just not on the same level spiritually? So you have liberals, conservatives, you have people saying you should follow Ellen White, you have people saying don't believe in Ellen White. So there's a whole range of belief system in the Adventist church. So that's one level. So you've got different Adventists. Let's just put it that way. So I'm going to challenge you. You didn't really believe different beliefs that you could marry anyone in the Adventist church. I think people are looking for someone. Is it true to say you're looking for someone like you? You're looking for someone who's going to meet your mind at your level and do what you do. Because if you've got an Adventist who eats meat and an Adventist who eats vegetarian, and they get married, they're going to have a bit of conflict over what they're going to eat. And this is something that happens every day, 2 or 3 times a day. Well, are we going to eat what you want, or are we going to eat either? Or are we going to meet someone in the middle? There's a potential for conflict. And when you're looking, I'm sure you had, even if you didn't write it down, you have a mental list, or you still do have a mental list of what you want in a partner. And you didn't really believe you could marry anyone in Adventism, even though that's a good place to start. So I think it's like any parable teaching, we have black and white. So we have the world, and we have the church, and we have secular and believers, and we have Adventists, and they're all good on one level. But then when you hone in, you go, actually, there's wheat and tares in here. So it's not that straightforward. So I guess you can compare and contrast with the world. So there are good worldlings and there are bad worldlings. But this says it's forbidden to marry anyone who doesn't believe. So on another level then, how do we see an unbeliever? What's another way you would want to define an unbeliever in this movement? How would you define an unbeliever? Has it changed since you've come in this movement? So before we said someone who's not SDA is an unbeliever. Now we would say you wouldn't even marry an SDA, would you? So someone not SDA. And now we say someone SDA is an unbeliever. Anyone else? So would you marry a Muslim? Would you say a Muslim's unbeliever? They believe in God. Would you consider it? Someone's smiling. Would you consider it? It's laughing. Why wouldn't you consider it? If they love God, they're faithful to their principles. They don't want to kill and steal, they want to kill and violence.
I think the principles of Islam, I don't know how liberal they can be, but in most cases what I've seen is that many of them are not that liberal. So it gets down to the problem of the practicality of this relationship. So that is where I think there can be a problem. But based on the type of God they worship, I may not have a big problem with that. The problem will come to how they integrate that God to our daily lives, whether they can do that, if they can be radical, if they can buy the principles of feminism. So I think that is what will affect my choices.
Good. So this man is saying that other religion, Islam, is not very liberal in its practice, and that even though they may appreciate the God they serve as similar in one way, the practice of that religion is very different, and that one of the examples you gave is equality, that they're perhaps not practicing equality how you would see it, and that would make it conflicting potentially. Is there anything else you missed? Does it pick up? Okay. So you're saying, let's put, we use this one as an example, but let's put other religions. And I think we could agree that other religions, the practice on a practical level, so Islam, keep Friday, they have different practices they have to fulfill, maybe praying 5 times a day, which is going to impact your life. So there's practical things about those religions, but the principles, you use the word principles, stroke practices. So you've got faith and belief, faith and practice. So although the faith, the principles may be similar in the sense that they perhaps keep the commandments, they think God is love, there are some, they don't believe in killing people or doing radical things, but their practice might be very different. So these have to harmonise for you to have a good experience, I would say. Anybody else want to put on there that we'd say is an unbeliever? So we've got someone not SDA, different beliefs. I guess that's similar to what we were saying here, but this could be atheism, this is other religions. What about other Christians then? Would we consider other Christians who are liberal? What would be wrong with that? Or would there be something wrong with that? Are they an unbeliever? Now, I'm going to put a question on Christians. I would put practicing equality, or practicing equality, perhaps. Let's put that. Because this movement is very small, and there are people in it who want to get married, and there isn't anyone they can find, or it's very challenging. So, would we consider marrying a Christian who practices equality, who's not in this movement or not holding the religious system that we have? Who would say yes, they would consider that? I'll be honest. I know I've talked to people, and I know that's not the truth, but no one's putting their hands up. And if you have considered it then, what stops you? Does anything stop you? What's the issue with that? So they believe in equality of the roles of male and female, or gender roles, whenever we see that, or the practicality of that in their home. They love God. Perhaps they don't keep Sabbath. Would that be an issue? You can manage it. So you've got to seriously think about it. So what do you think? Sorry, I don't know your name. What's your name? David. What do you think, David? Give me the pros and cons, or at least a pro and con. What are you thinking?
Still, it is not advisable because as much as that we practice of that equality, that our beliefs and doctrines and knowledge of that, there are also other factors or other doctrines we practice, but they might also be listened. So, knowing such a person, to some extent, maybe you will not agree with some other aspects of equality.
Yeah. So he's saying that we have connections on equality, but our doctrine in this movement, we have, I'm going to say, it's not using a greater knowledge of God than the other person, and our practice might be different. So I think we have to think about what it means to believe something. So this is a set of ideology. This is an ideology or principles, and we have a huge and a deep knowledge of prophecy, which shapes our worldview. So so people will say, and I've heard this question, that if they believe in equality, and this is our text, then surely this is the thing that's the most important right now. And I think we just have to remember that, we've got the 4 and the 6. So we're focused right now on the 6, and loving your neighbour, and that relationship with each other. We're told in the image of God, we know about nature and humanity, that in all relationships, we're trying to make connections and have that meeting of minds. So we want to connect with people and talk about things we have in common, compare and contrast, perhaps talk about things we don't have in common, have a debate, have a discussion. But you're looking for something that can connect with someone else. And that's on many levels. So it's not that simple to say, just because they're SGA or just because they're this way, that we get on. And we all know that. We meet people in their everyday lives, and there's something that we just click with straight away. And I probably challenge you to define what that is about the person that makes you click. And this is similar to attraction. So if you have an attraction to someone, can you explain to me how that works, why that is? So why do you, let's say sexual attraction. So he's smiling. Can anybody explain sexual attraction? And I would probably challenge you to say that's very difficult. How do we define what that is? So you see someone and your heart starts racing, you may have physical sensations in the body, and then we talk about people getting sexually aroused. You may not get sexually aroused then, you may just feel some excitement of some kind, and some connection and some desire to be with the person. And you can't qualify or quantify what that is. And I think we're only really scratching the surface with science, and we've come a long way, but we still don't fully understand, and we don't understand so much, like 10% of the brain we use apparently. So if there's 90% we don't even understand how it works. And we've been obviously tapping into gender and sexuality, and what makes someone be male and female, what makes them sexually attracted to this person and not this person. And all those things are still very hard to define and understand, because you can't make that happen with someone. And it's almost out of your control when it does happen. So that's an aspect of it. And then that complexity is the same with this argument. So marrying an unbeliever is on multiple levels. So we're given some foundational principles that will help guide us in that. And then on top of that, we have attraction. So the unbelief, the opposite of that is a believer. And a believer believes in something, obviously. And it's really important how those beliefs shape your life. So beliefs shape life. And which ones are important to you, or the most important? And that's what you've got to know for yourself for a start. So many people are too young to make that decision because they don't really know what they think themselves before they're even looking about what they want in someone else. So I think the simple answer is a believer is not just a Christian or an SDA, but it's someone who believes in the same ideology as you do, on the same level as, or at least you're trying to get it as the same level as you do. So there's the system of belief, there's how strongly you believe it, and then there's how you practice it. So there's kind of three aspects that we can break it down into, even with on that level. So, and that belief system, how strongly you believe it, is how much it will determine and affect your practice. So you're looking for that in someone. You're looking for, if you're dedicated to the movement, you're keeping up with the messages, you're studying avidly, you're looking for someone who's doing the same thing. And you want at that meeting to be on that level. So it's not someone who just believes in the movement even. And it's even deeper than that. Like I said, it's not just about marrying someone who's SDA and has the same belief system. It's how they practice and how much they believe that system. So we know it's quite on a deep level. Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 7, 12 to 16. Let's put that down. Is where we get this idea about believers and unbelievers. So one of the questions that was asked, I was familiar when you do courtship classes. So I recommend, if you're thinking about courtship and marriage, I recommend you watch the classes that are in courtship and marriage. And there's quite a few of them. You did a lot of question and answer sessions and really gave some thorough answers to some of these questions that we're still asking and some people are still confronted by. So this question was, if you married to someone who was in the message but now is not, do you consider them an unbeliever? And the simple answer is yes, because they're not in the same belief system or the same level as you are. So in 1 Corinthians 7 it says, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any man has a wife that believeth not, and should be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. And if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister, a man or a woman, is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So people could use this as an argument. It says here that the believing spouse will affect the unbelieving spouse for heaven. So isn't it a good idea? It could be on one level. But the context of this is that those already in that situation. And I think we've got to remember that God is always trying to restore in the situation people are in and work with people where they're at. So this counsel is given to say, look, just because they're an unbeliever doesn't mean you should leave them now. So there are people in the movement, I think, who, when accepted equality and their spouse didn't, are now wrestling with, do I leave them? Is this the time to leave them because it's abusive, like submitting, and they're not, obviously if it is abusive, we did encourage people all to say, yes, you should be leaving, you shouldn't stay in an abusive situation. But how do you define abuse? And abuse isn't someone not agreeing with you or not seeing things the same way. So it's important, I think, to factor that in. Paul is saying, he's speaking, it's not written in the Old Testament because people already know the rules. If you're Jewish, you're not allowed to marry outside of the Hebrew faith. You're an apostate or a heathen if you're not Jewish. So the Jews already knew that principle. So there were not mixed marriages in the Jewish economy. So what's Paul talking about here? He's not talking about a worldling. Same as Ellen White, when she says we shouldn't marry an unbeliever. In the context she's speaking, nearly everyone in America at the time was Christian. She was living in a Christian nation. So when she says unbeliever, she's not even talking about someone who's in the world. She's talking about another Christian with different viewpoints. So I think we can see from that that even in Ellen White's context, she's saying that's forbidden. Because the context she's in is they're all Christian, and the context Paul's in, they're all Jewish. So he's not saying don't marry someone outside the Jew. They knew that. But it's saying that they're mixed in the Jewish economy. So they're never in a position where you want to change your religion when they're already married, because they're already Jewish. You do have Hebrews who go into apostasy and do heathen practices, but this did not change their religion. So now in the New Testament, Hebrews, one changes their religion. So Paul's addressing this problem now, that up to this point they've all been Jewish, and now they're becoming Christian. And now there's a difference. So I think we can relate that to, we were all SDA before, and now we're coming into the movement, and our doctrine is different. And it's creating this friction. So we could say we're changing from Laodicea to Ephesus. And that changed. This is the first time it's ever happened in Paul's time. So moving dispensations from Jewish to Christian, increasingly we find ourselves married to unbelievers, which looks different. They don't complain or they're not silent, but the whole demeanour tells you that they're not in the movement. So there's people who perhaps profess to be in the movement and they're not really practicing, as we said, on the same level as you. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about that? Challenges, disagree? Please speak out if you want to challenge it. So this is from 5T 366.1. So it's 5 Testimonies 366.1. In this age of the world, as the scenes of Earth's history are soon to close, and we are about to enter upon a time of trouble such as never was, the fewer the marriages contracted, the better for all, both men and women. Above all, when Satan is working with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, let Christians beware of connecting themselves with unbelievers. God has spoken. All who fear God will submit to God's wise injunctions. Our feelings, our impulses, our affections must flow heavenward, not earthward, not in a low-based channel of sensual thought and indulgence. It is time now that every soul should stand as in the sight of a heart-searching God. So, as we've said, Ellen White's living in Protestant America. Most people are Christian, so the only thing that makes SDAs different is not Jesus, it's health reform, the Sabbath, prophetic understanding, peculiar Christian views. So she's saying you can't marry someone who hasn't got those peculiar Christian views that you've got. So easy for people to think if you marry a Christian, it's okay. The unbelievers she's referring to are probably nominal Christians, regular Christians, they're not worldly people. So she's speaking about not marrying people who don't have the same perspective of the great controversy as we have. People use this quote often to discourage people from marrying. So I don't know if we think that we should apply this, where we're approaching the time of trouble. Do we think the fewer marriages contracted, the better? Do we think that's a good idea? So in other words, we shouldn't be getting married now in the movement. What do you think, Josie? That's Josie. Good one as well. Do you think it's still okay to get married?
Well, it's a question that I think I'll probably be biased on.
That's why I asked.
Very good. Yeah. Well, I think it's cautionary to get married at this phase, especially if it's really going to impose or stumbling blocks in the way of your practice of your faith, in a way that's going to frustrate your Christianity, as we're saying. Yeah. But my feelings aside, my feelings would lean towards this idea of people should get married because I'm not really at the way. Yeah.
So you're just saying he's biased because he's thinking of getting married, but perhaps we need to be cautious in this time period. So I think she's saying the fewer the marriages contracted, the better for all, both men and women. But I think we have to see the context of that. So she thinks the time of trouble is approaching. Obviously in her day it wasn't, but and the context of that is they should be aware of connecting with unbelievers and acting on sensual thought and indulgence. So she's not necessarily speaking against it from the perspective of we shouldn't do it at all. I think it's in that context of on false premises. So because we have a desire for physical relationship, sex, that's driving us, that takes over the feelings. We're not coming together to glorify God, and we should not entangle ourselves with unbelievers on the wrong basis. So I think there are parameters within that. So Joseph's thinking, getting married in the movement, if you know the person a long time. I think there are dangers if someone's coming into the movement, you don't know them, they've got no background in the movement, they haven't got the same belief system, again, or the same level as you have, then there are red flags to that. But I think we're still saying in the movement it's okay to get married. And this question was asked by Marina, and the answer, is it okay to get married in the Sunday law time period? And of course, we now believe we are in the Sunday law time period. And can you remember what the answer was? Yes or no? She thinks it was yes. Do you agree? It was yes. It was yes, and obviously, and even in the time of trouble, that would be a bit late in the day. So I think the caution was, it's a bit late in the day in the time of trouble, things are wrapping up, and if this is a time when people are going to be separated, It might be to move with big caution that you don't know. If you don't know someone well enough, you're not sure if you're going to follow up. And that's always been the challenge. So even when you get married to somebody who thinks on the same page, on the same level, as you progress in your Christian walk, in your life, challenges come up that change people. And you've got no guarantee that person isn't going to change. In this movement, we've had so much life that challenges us. And we've had to change our old way of thinking and move into a new one. And at any stage in that journey, someone can decide, I don't want to do this anymore. And now you're stuck because you're not on the same page anymore. You go through that up and down experience even when you did everything you could, so it's still a risk. And obviously as things get more and more difficult in the world, and you believe that Ellen White talks about Holy Spirit being withdrawn and the devil having more and more control over people, there's going to be more polarization. You know, we see in the external world there's this partisan spirit in America with Democrats and Republicans, and that's can be reflected in the world, that people are taking sides. So I think the conclusion with unbelievers is that the level of belief system, what you believe, how strongly you believe it, how strongly you practice it, are all three things you need to look at. And all that has to be done as a foundation before even considering that you're attracted to them. Because you can potentially get attracted to anybody, and I don't know if people have that experience where they've walked into a room, been attracted to someone and thought, whoa, what's this? And you know intellectually, I'm a Christian, they're not a Christian, maybe someone you work with, maybe someone you've associated with in another circle, and you've felt something that you can't identify, and you thought, what's going on here? Now you could follow that and go, this is real, I really like this person, I'm really attracted to them, this can work. But actually that's just that one level. And all those three levels have to be considered in their context. So I would still say it's dangerous to marry someone outside of the movement, and even in the movement, proceed with caution. So that's, I guess, the summary. Yeah. What's your name, sir? Rick. Nice to meet you.
Question, the first one, first Corinthians 16. Isn't it like Paul is, when it's like saying, those ones who are already there, therefore you don't have to separate, maybe something happen. Does that mean, like, it's not, Paul is not saying, it's not in black and white to reject marriage between believers and believers, but it is risky. So it's assessed based on risks. Therefore, if it is before you marry and you marry an unbeliever, therefore you really understand maybe the risks and risks come with it, as opposed to putting it black and white that this is wrong and that is right.
So you're asking, is this, as opposed to just putting it in black and white, it's wrong or right, Paul is saying it's risky. So it's okay to do it if you want to take that risk. But I think I wouldn't use that passage for this. I think the context of this passage is addressing the Jewish Christian, the people who are Jewish, become a Christian, are in that situation, and saying and giving them counsel not to leave at this point. So you don't have to leave, because in their mind, they're processing it the other way, I think. So they're saying, as a Jew, I'm not allowed to marry a non-Jew, in their old thinking. So, and now I find myself married to a non-Jew, because they're not the same as me. Do I have to now leave because it was a sin? It's forbidden to marry a non-Jew in their society. So Paul's saying, no, you're not sinning by staying with them. And I think that's the emphasis. So you can't use this to justify going and marrying a non-believer because it's okay to stay with them. I don't think that's the context. I think the context of it is it's okay. It's not a sin to stay with them. Because in their mind, they're thinking, I have to separate now because we're different. And he's saying, no, you're already together. Work with it, and God can use you to influence them for heaven. Now, that's a conflicting, perhaps, idea with the fact that we say we shouldn't mix with worldlings because they're going to influence us for hell, which is what we said at the beginning, worldly associated as a stumbling block. And so you've got to weigh those two things up and say, okay, on one level we've got to be cautious mixing with people who don't believe the same thing. But in this context, I think he's saying, you can do that now, you're already there. But let's work together, work with God on it, and God can use you in that situation. And I think that's all you can use that passage for. I don't think you can use it to justify marrying an unbeliever. Because Paul is damage control, let's put it that way. It's a bit like using the passage about slavery and saying, Paul says go back, it's okay to have a slave. If you just go back and be a good slave, you could say that in a similar context. And Paul's like endorsing it's okay to have slavery then, isn't it? Because if it's a good slave and it's a good master, it's fine, it works. And that's exactly the argument that they were using in the South to justify slavery in the Civil War. And the whole context of that is damage control. God's saying, you can't overthrow society right now. Everyone has slaves. We can't tell him not to be a slave because he'll get killed. So it's for his benefit. Paul says, just go back, and tries to talk to the master too, and says, treat him nicely. But in the context you're in, let's try and manage it with the gospel principles as much as we can. And I think that's what we've got to apply to everything. So many of us are in family dynamics which are not ideal. So many of us are married to people who perhaps believe the message, and we have children who don't believe the message. So we chose to marry someone because they're on the same ideological page as us. And this is one of the reasons I literally don't have children, but anyway, that you want to live with someone who believes the same thing and practices the same thing. And then you have this baby who's, when they're very small, it's okay because you can manage it and you can control it. But as they get bigger, they make choices now. And now they might not be on the same page as you, so their ideology is different. And now, 24/7, you've got to live with an unconverted person. In fact, from day one, you're living with an unconverted person. Children are unconverted. And until they get to an age of accountability, they can't make that choice to be converted. So until that may be 15, 16, 17, 18, it might never happen. And you now have to manage that situation. And it's stressful, very stressful. And if you've been a parent of a teenager, and if you've been a teenager, we know that in that time period, you're wrestling with so many things. You've got to decide what you want to do with your life. You've got to decide if you want to marry, who you want to marry, who you're attracted to. All these hormones are going on. And we've talked about this in the Courtship of Marriage, the principles to give teenagers especially space to make those decisions and to be awkward and to be upset and to be emotional because they're trying to find their way in the world. Their parents have given them some ideology and they've got to choose if they want to follow it or not, if they agree or not, and they're finding themselves. And then on top of that, they've got this pressure from the world. What are you going to do? How are you going to do your education? What are you going to do with your relationships? And it's a lot to handle. So I think how I got down there, children. And that's one reason to consider carefully about having children, because as they get older, it becomes an avenue for Satan to use to really deal with your faith. And that's just one problem or challenge with having children. So let's talk about, does that answer your question?
Yes, can I add one?
Yes, please.
Ellen White. So Ellen White was again said that they should go what? Like racial marriages. White and black.
Okay, racial marriages.
And there's a relationship gave. And then there's a relationship gave also on invitation and believer. If you compare the reasons, are they like all of them the same, leading to the same point that is harmony or something like that? But I think currently we say everyone to be wrong on grace, but on faith, the believer, the reasons are we still believe. Instead, consistency in both. Ellen White was wrong in one, even in that time.
So you're saying that is there some consistency? Because Ellen White seems to be saying that it's wrong to marry an unbeliever, and we're still saying that. So she's right on that issue. But she said it was wrong for blacks and whites to marry, and we're saying that's not correct anymore. So, okay, so first of all, we have to consider context, like we just did with Paul, when the time they're writing, and what the principles at the time they're writing. And I think we've already shown in Ellen White's time that our scope of unbeliever might be different to hers, so there might be more different types of unbelievers than there were in her day, because they all profess to believe Christianity, so you've got to take that into consideration. But she was still correct in the sense that the principle behind that is marry someone who's on the same ideological page as you. And so that's the principle behind it, and we can see that that's logical. How we apply the definition, as Effie said, of unbeliever now might broaden, there might be more different people in the world who we could say are unbelievers that she wouldn't even consider that. But I think we can see how the principle's correct. And I think that the race issue, we have to consider time and chance in the sense of the period she was in. So the context of that, I think, would still apply in the sense of culturally what's acceptable and what's going to be. You have to consider time and place, and I think that's what she was doing. So time and place in the South at that time, blacks and whites didn't mix. It was hard enough to evangelise blacks, let alone have relationships with them. It just wasn't done. So she's saying, proceed with caution. This is not a good idea. Just like Paul sending the slave back, it's not a good idea not to go back. So in that context, it's life-threatening, and it's not just life-threatening. I think there's a depth to that the blacks and whites were so different in their community that you might have a real problem relating. And similar today, we might say with national, different nations. So we're not saying you shouldn't marry someone from a different country. There's a cultural heritage that we've got to consider. There's a cultural practice in that country. There's a context to that person's background that you have to consider. And I think that's where she's coming from with black and white. She's not doing it because they're black, per se. She's doing it because they're so different, and the way that society treats them. It's not going to be easy to have a marriage in that society at that point in time. So now we've moved down, and the society we live in, and it still could be the case. There's places in the south of America where they have black and white churches, and if you go as a black person or a white person, but normally you hear it this way, a black person goes to a white church and they say, you're in the wrong place, your church is not right. And that's Christian, that's Adventist even. So there are places in the world where it would be much harder to have a mixed racial marriage, for instance. And I think you have to consider that. So here in Kenya, like we're in this room, and nearly everybody's black. So if a white person came, and it might be hard for them to fit into that, to be the only white person with a black person in a community of black people, and we might say that's probably not a good idea, depending on how the community would teach them. So you've got to look at that, and then say, actually, like Kenyans are very friendly to, I'm just using it as an example, very friendly to white people. There's no racial attacks on that level. The society is quite safe. I don't think there'll be any problems. There'll be different challenges, but it wouldn't be any problem on a cultural level for them to do that. So I think time and place has to be considered in any marriage situation. And does that make sense? So I think we'd still say the principle behind what she's saying is correct. Consider the time and place and the culture that you're looking at. So if we take it a step back and say it's not per se a racial issue, she's not saying blacks and whites shouldn't marry because they're black and white. She's saying because of the context they're in that time period, that's not a good idea, it's going to be dangerous. And that would be the case if a Muslim was marrying a Christian, say, in a country which is predominantly Muslim, depending on where you are and what the circumstances are. So we could apply that principle to other situations. Now, we would still say it's wrong because your belief system is different from Christian, but we wouldn't say any nation should marry another nation on the principle of their different skin color. I don't think we'd say that now. But there are places in the world where we would recommend it. And we perhaps wouldn't recommend marriage in general for women. So like in countries where it's much harder to be a woman, and there's a dowry system, and there's support and so on, is a whole part of culture. And there are countries in Africa which are really extreme on this issue. We'd say, don't get married, get an education, even leave the country. Because as a woman in that culture, you'll never be treated right, and you'll always be abused, because the whole culture is set up to do that. So it's very difficult to practice equality. I think that would be a similar argument we'd say not to get married because of the consequences of that in enabling you to practice equality. And you've got extended family pressure. So some cultures, the family is a huge pressure. So where I'm from in the West, there's less pressure from extended family. So like my uncles and aunts wouldn't get involved in my marrying. It's just not done. My parents might get involved, but they want me to make my decision. They say, you do what you want, it's your life. Whereas a lot of other cultures, the family gets to say who does what, and extended family, uncles, aunts, grandparents, even the same tribe is bigger than that, can put pressure on one person to do something, and that has to be considered. And not to say that you wouldn't do it then, but you've got to understand the risk of it. Does that help?
Okay, so the principle is, the side of principle is correct. It's the one for considering cultural like adaptation and coordination skills.
Yes.
Okay. Will that be, of course, that is like be careful, but in the long run, when it's like, will it bring a problem? Like people could be fixed on that, and then they, as we go ahead, they still say, we're examining also conditions here, but I think because fundamentally people are not different anyway, we can think if one person is married here to black community, they could face some, maybe they could face some kind of racism or some attacks based on, we have not seen someone like this, and then there's some comments about that, and I see that would be the reason why we are canceling. That is, we could avoid this in the first place. But that is where maybe young grand people could see that as a justification or misunderstanding when it comes to what you consider differences. And I say, okay, we have fundamental differences based on our nature, not even because you have differences you have with them. That be like risk in that society.
So are you asking, is the risk of saying that people will use that as a reason not to do it? Or
Yes, we use that to say the reason why we must cancel not to having racial marriages in this condition would be because we are fundamentally different in our nature.
okay, so
The nature of humanity is the same.
you say the danger of looking at it that way is that because of our different races, we're actually fundamentally different in our nature. Therefore, we shouldn't get married. And becomes a racial argument, it becomes racial prejudice, using that culture in the context. And I think that the important point about the quote about blacks and whites, and we haven't looked at it, is the very argument that it isn't that. And I think when you lay that down, Ellen White is not saying blacks and whites should never marry because they're black and white. And I think that's the important point. That's the foundation. It's not because of the colour of their skin. That's not the reason why she's saying that. The reason is because of the cultural context and the setting they're in at that time. And you could say perhaps her own biases and prejudice. So maybe it's just not the country, and maybe there was racial prejudice there that this is not right to do that. She counseled for a long time for blacks and whites to worship separately. I don't think that she believed that it was wrong for blacks and whites to worship together, in principle, because they're black and white. It's just because of the context of the times that it wasn't safe to worship together and it wasn't sensible. It would hinder the work. And I think that's the point. It's the same with the slavery argument in Paul's day. You could see that it would hinder the spreading of the gospel if they started to tamper with the traditions of society or the laws of society that weren't ready to shift. Now we're in a time when those laws have shifted. We have the civil rights movement, we have equality, we have people practicing that and believing that, the governments are instituting laws on it, positively, and so the whole context of our society is different. So now we can say, based on that, it's fine for blacks and whites to get married on that principle. So I think that would help to counter that, but you can't use that as a racist argument because the whole point of saying that is not based on race, it's not based on black and white, it's based on the context of the society. And that's what we have to consider. So even now we have to consider that and not do it because we've got different cultures, but recognise the challenges of that. So now we've got a movement that's scattered over the world. There's very few people in different countries who can find partners, so they're going elsewhere to find them. And they're looking at camp meetings or travelling to try and see if there's, or online. And that's a whole new dynamic having an online relationship because we really don't understand the culture of a person unless you go there physically and are in contact with them. So perhaps we can think about that in the next presentation. So we started 15 minutes. So let's talk about sex. And so this is something else that comes up. So the question is it okay to have sex outside marriage? So, and if it's okay or if it's not okay, why or why not? So, and the Bible calls that fornication. We know that Ellen White talks about fornication, and she's quite strong about people not having sexual relationship outside marriage. But I know with our embracing, I guess, culture and society that we're in, and trying to harmonise in some degree with our cultures, trying to understand where people are coming from, trying to sympathise and support people, even though we might not agree with what they're doing. Some people have, I think, seen that it's okay to do this now. And I don't know whether anyone here has shifted their position on that. If they have, but people are saying, why? And especially if in the back of your mind you're thinking, I'm going to get married to this person, why can't I? Even if you've made a decision to get married to them, it's still before the marriage ceremony. What do people think? Is it okay to have sexual relations? And I suppose you can ask, what does that look like as well? So, any thoughts? Yeah.
Is masturbation sex? So like that you can salvation someone before marriage masturbate, maybe they understand as sex. And then we see whether it's okay or not okay.
So when I'm using sexual relations, I'm using sexual relations between two people. So in our context, it could be any gender, but it's sexual relations between two people. So I don't see masturbation in the same category. And I know Ellen White talks against masturbation, and she's quite strong about it, but we know that one of the things she says is that people that do that a lot will go into mental asylums, and that's just simply not true. So I think we know scientifically that's not true. We don't see that in people's experience, because I think pretty much, well, I don't know if we can prove this statistically, but most people masturbate or have masturbated in the past to a lesser or greater extent, and we don't see people in mental homes because of that, on that level. So I think in that sense, culture and science has moved on from it. I don't personally think it's a sin. I think there are people with really strong sexual drives who can't find a partner, and what are they going to do with that? And I know I'm not too familiar with the male anatomy, or maybe even the female anatomy, except my own experience, but with the male anatomy, I know that people have wet dreams, that it's almost like you can't help it, and the body needs to release those things. So on one level, I think there's a place for that. But like anything, there's temperance that's involved, and it's anything that we enjoy doing, we can do to excess. So there's that aspect of it. And so perhaps I might address people who do it to excess, and who. But when I'm talking about sexual relations, I'm talking about doing it with someone else because of the impact on your main with that. So there's two arguments. There's one is you're managing your life and it's your choice with masturbation. With sexual relations with someone else, it impacts someone else. And that's where it's this love your neighbour. What does love your neighbour look like? So that's how I would see that. So did anyone want to comment about sexual relations outside of marriage? So is it okay to kiss someone when you're not married in a sexual way? Obviously you might kiss on a relative on the cheek, I'm not talking about that. So who thinks it's okay to do that? One doesn't want to talk. This is a difficult subject. It was difficult for me at first. I'm British, we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about sex and fornication. It's like, this is and especially in the conservative Christian SDA, that's something that happens behind closed doors. But I think it's really important because we could use the society argument. Society now has moved on from that. Ellen White's time, nobody lived together. Nobody lived together who wasn't married. They didn't do that. Nobody just cohabited. So we didn't have all these partnerships that are not recognised by the state in that sense. And now the state recognises people living together without being married. So our society has accepted all these relationships that people are having, and they accept fornication. I mean, people don't accept adultery so much. If you've already got a partner and you're going to sleep with someone else, then that's still not society as acceptable as perhaps Satan would want it to be, but it's acceptable for people to live together. Obviously, in Christian circles it isn't, but most people are not Christian. So I would say the majority of the people in I don't know about here, but UK would say there's nothing wrong with people living together in a relationship. It's just about commitment. So on that level, societies and culture is okay with fornication because they're living together without being married and having sex. And the danger in any society is that we accept the practices that are around us. And when we read about Abraham, the reason he had many wives or he married more than one is because the society around him said it was okay. David, polygamy, and God allowed it. So there's this element of God endorsing, or not endorsing, but allowing things that society says is okay. So I think people could go down that route and justify this is okay. So is it still, good counsel that not to have sexual relations outside marriage? And Ellen White's time is very Victorian. Everybody got married and they didn't do that. So if you were a loose woman, definitely, and a bit of a, what's the word for the man that would do that? But they would have a word for that. There was a stigma for men and women sleeping around. So she's writing in that context. So do we have an answer? So as conservatives, we were teaching before, well certainly I was, we had counsels to courtship and marriage, and I went to the counsel on it together in a book, and she also has the I think she has sexual relations and adultery, something along that line, it's not a good title. And in there it makes it clear that people should make the decision as a business level, they should intellectually know their partner, they should have their tick list, they They should see how they treat their parents. There's lots of things we can look at. They need to believe the same thing. They need to have a good living. They need to be able to provide for themselves before they're qualified or fit to be married. And we go through all that, and we say you've got to look at all that first. And obviously, the only reason you're looking at that is because you're attracted to the person, well, one reason. So there is an attraction there you've got to manage. But it's much easier to manage that if there's no physical contact. Because the minute physical contact comes in, emotions take over. And then people are driven by the emotion, because the physical is exciting, it's stimulating, and once you start doing it, you want it. So then you think, I want to marry this person because it feels good. And you don't intellectually process it properly. So you need to do that first and do all your homework, and then say, okay, let's get married now. So until you've done all that, you're not safe to have physical contact. It's for your benefit not to, and that's the principle. So we were teaching, certainly Maggie and myself, young people that don't have any physical contact, don't even hug, don't shake hands, and we got to the point where, what about our first school we ran, I think second school, we'd tell the girls, don't shake hands with the boys, so it's like, don't touch them, don't touch each other, don't let them touch you. So they would be reticent even to hug each other. So we had cultural problems when people came from different places. So if somebody came from Holland where they were a bit more touchy-feely, or Mediterranean countries, because British aren't touchy-feely. We don't hug, we don't kiss, we don't do that unless it's a relative. So, but in Mediterranean, Italians, they'll come up and kiss men will kiss men on the cheek. So it's much more of a, say, touchy-feely physical culture. And so we were telling them that was the division. You weren't allowed to sleep in the same house on your own. So if you were two in the same place, a male and a female, especially if you're courting, you won't have to be together. You need a chaperone for safety, because you're going to end up doing something physically, and it's sleeping with each other, having sex. And then as equality came, we began to see that a lot of that is isolationist as well, and it doesn't promote relationships between male and female on a level that's not sexual, because all that says is you're bound to end up in bed together if you spend any time or touch each other in any way, and that is really a narrow view of sexuality. And because we've now started studying sexuality and gender, we're saying actually it's not clear if everyone's completely male or female and doesn't want to identify as either or. But there's a spectrum of gender. There's also a spectrum of sexuality. So what we're going to say now, you're not going to touch anybody, because you might, if you're homosexual, there might be feelings there if you give them a hug. It's not consistent to say don't touch anyone. So then you have to follow that through and say, okay, you need to stop thinking in a sexual way. Victorian England, which says, I think this is very Victorian, elements in that era where sex is just not spoken about. We just, it's dirty, it's dirty, basically. And that view had spilled over into us because of Ellen White. I think a lot of where we actually misunderstandings has come from Ellen White and the way we interpreted that, or what she's actually said as well. So we've got to take that into consideration and say, okay, women have been sexualized, and that's why we're in this mess. So it's usually the woman that's been used as a sexual object, and because of that, we've said, stay away from everything, keep away, stop, because men are just sexual fiends and women are the objects. So then we adjust that and say, actually, we're all human in the image of God, that the nature of humanity is a choice, and we shouldn't assume that just because two people are close to each other, they're going to end up having sex. It doesn't make sense. So now we relax that and we say, it's good to get to know male and female, it's good to hug each other, to greet, it's good to relax about that and not feel that everything is going to become sexual. So in that perspective, we're not saying don't touch each other, we're not saying don't in a non-sexual way, but I think still in a sexual way, we're saying it's not a good idea until you know you've committed to them as a marriage partner. So I would personally still say it's probably not a good idea to kiss. Holding hands, we probably say it's okay, because some cultures they hold hands anyway. But I think it's bearing in mind that the line keeps moving. When you're physically attracted to someone, it's very difficult to have that self-control, depending on the strength of it, depending on the individuals. So I think it's still good counsel that be very cautious in physical contact, because you're really still getting to know each other intellectually, and that's what courtship's about. It's not about the physical, really. So reserve that till the marriage. Does that make sense? Does anyone want to come back on that? Carl?
I have two questions or two comments. The first one is, so my opinion, I think it's it's not a good idea to have sex before marriage because of one thing is the issue of sex. Now it becomes a thing about basically or your relationship with this person, whether you are in a committed one or not. It just becomes a thing about you two, and there's no connection to the outside world in a way. There's no level of, in case something wrong happens or anything goes awry, there's no accountability, there's no security. Especially for maybe the woman might be more vulnerable for something to happen. And when it happens in this context, there is no security. You just had a consensual sexual relationship. We're not talking about an abusive one. You both agree to have it, but then something may go wrong, and you may need some security. You will not have it because this is not recognized by the community, by the society, by the law, by the government. And then there's the issue of accountability to whatever you believe. So if you decide, I'm just gonna have sex with this person and it's between me and the person, it's just about us, then even for we as a movement where we believe about the world, we believe in equality and all these things, you're not really having skin in the game. You're not putting your experience to use in the movement because it's not recognized in the movement. It's not part of the movement. You know what I'm trying to say?
So, when you say you're not recognizing the movement,
you're not recognized in the movement.
you're not recognizing the movement because the movement says it's not okay to do it.
If you're married in the movement, you're going to be married under the by the prayer of an elder. You're going to get sanctioned by the movement. So it's not. It is not in that way a marriage which you can say this is under the blessing of the movement. So and it means it's not accountable. It means it's even if something goes wrong to it, how can the movement come in and help anything? Because you never involved the movement anybody in the beginning in this thing. So those are that's why I think it's wrong. But I'm open to if someone can prove me wrong, I'm also open to that. But this is how I see it.
So, and you said as well in the accountability one, it's not approved by the culture, the society.
No, the culture might be.
Right, because I was going to say, I think most cultures are approving, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. But yeah, there's no security. Because there's no commitment between you. You can both walk away after you've done that. But usually, the woman ends up in the worst place. So she's vulnerable, especially if there's pregnancy. So pregnancy is a big risk. And obviously now with contraception, it's not so high, but people still make mistakes and seem to do these things without using contraception and then end up with a baby, and that's obviously the single parent stigma on the woman, and the woman gets left with all that. So it's potentially abusive to women if you're a man thinking of doing it. If you're a woman, why are you letting someone take that advantage of you when there's no commitment? Years ago, when we talked about this topic, we would say you're committing adultery in advance. So if you're not going to marry that person, then you're committing adultery with someone in advance, in the sense that you're now being unfaithful to the person you're going to marry in the future. And you're not preserving yourself for that person. And I think the biggest thing is just not approved by the movement, because it's not approved by God. And the reason it isn't because God doesn't want people to have fun. So what's the purpose of sex? So I think that is probably something we think about as well. So I think many people, especially in different cultures, think the purpose of sex is to have children. And certainly that's how I would say the Bible perhaps frames it. So it says Adam knew his wife and she conceived. So the direct result of knowing or having sex, knowing the person intimately, is to conceive, to have children. And I think many people culturally still have that viewpoint. So if we do compare and contrast and we go to, can two people be married and not have sex? Can two people get married and not have sex? Yes. Why? And how or what would that look like necessarily? Because you might say, why are they getting married? They could just stay friends. If they don't have sex.
So I think marriage is bigger than sex. about companionship and support, including emotional, just setting your life up together. And that can happen even to people who don't have sex drive or have other issues that may not allow them to have sex or to enjoy sex. And I think considering what marriage brings to people, the bigger picture, it is possible to forego the aspect of sex for these bigger benefits that marriage brings. So I don't think it is necessary that sex is equated to marriage in that sense. You can have a sexual person, you can have people who have other issues. We've seen people who perhaps get accidents after sex and they still live, enjoy that marriage without having sex. So using those examples, I think you can be in a marriage without having sex as long as all of you have consented to that and are happy with that, considering the picture.
Absolutely, I think that's a good answer. And marriage is bigger than sex, and you said it's emotional, I would say spiritual, intellectual, physical, outside of marriage, even physical support. There's so many aspects of the human being, and this is all support. And I was going to say something else on emotions. Yeah, and the reasons you gave why, so people can you can get married and you can have a good sex life, and then it can change because for various reasons. So, like say, you can have an accident, you can get older, people go through menopause when you don't want it anymore. Men might not want it anymore, and that for whatever reason, and they still stay happily married. Or you get old and neither one wants to do it because you're old and tired. So there's many reasons why they might not do it, but they're still married, like you say, and they still get emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical support. And I think that, I suppose the key to marriage is I want to put the word intimacy. So this is about intimacy, and this is obviously a parable for our intimacy with God. And the height of that intimacy in a marriage is, I suppose, is sex. And one of the reasons is is the fact that someone gets to know you on a physical level that no one else gets that knowledge of, and you have to be vulnerable. It's a bearing of the soul. And when we think about clothes in scripture, it's all connected to character. It's all connected to who you are as a person and all those things. When you're naked, there's something about exposure. So there has to be a level of trust there to have sex that actually isn't there with everybody. So you know them so well that you're willing to trust them with your soul. And I think that's what it is with God. You know God so well, you know God as a friend, you offload all your feelings and your thoughts, and there's a trust there with God that God will never harm you in that process. And when you have sex, you're making yourself vulnerable in a way that you don't with anybody else. And that's why it's a huge step, and it has to be done in a safe environment. And a safety is a committed relationship. So that's why God is giving us that parameter to say, look, if you want to be safe and committed and really enjoy the blessing of that. So it is, I think you said to have children, it's to have fun. It's supposed to be an enjoyable experience to unite the couple. So I would say to unite people, bring them in a closeness that you don't have with other people. It's a privilege, I think. Well, that's why Ellen White calls it the marriage privilege, in a sense. And I'm sure we could think of other reasons for it, so that it's not just about having children. I think that's the important point. So people can have a happy sex life in a marriage and not have any children, because it's not the purpose of the marriage to have children, per se.
What about this perspective that sex is purely physical? You can separate all your emotions and that sort of thing. You can have a sex life with anybody who, whenever you need it, you just have it, and then your friends, your people who you love are a different category. I've heard people give that. Maybe is this a way someone can look at it, or what's wrong with looking? Is there something wrong with looking at it in this way? That it's purely, physical. You don't have to have emotions. You keep your emotions for the people you love, and sex is just, you don't have to have.
And I think that's a valid argument in the sense that people in society and perhaps even in the room would use that argument that it's just physical. and I can do that with anyone. That's just like going for a job or whatever. And obviously there's different belief systems in the world now. I don't know if has everybody heard of polyamory? Do you know what polyamory is?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's having multiple partners, but both people agree that they can have multiple partners. So it's not adultery in the same way, but they justify having sex with other people. So definitely society says it's okay to do it and justifies it on different levels. And I think for us, with our understanding of the nature of humanity, that is threefold. It's mind, body, spirit, and we would never disconnect them on any level. So we say when we eat food, it affects how we think and feel on a very basic level, and eating food is a physical phenomenon. But we all know scientifically that what you eat can harm your body and can harm your mind. So we know that people who eat a lot of junk food, more prone to depression. People that eat a lot of junk food, more prone to obesity, physical problems. So they've got physical and mental and emotional issues just from eating the type of food or drink that they eat and drink. So we know that you can't separate the threefold nature of humanity. So I think we have to take that into consideration. And so what one aspect does will affect the others, and we are not clever enough to know how that works in detail. So we've got some science to prove some of that, but we're not. I think we can't underestimate the spiritual element either. So we don't really know how that affects us spiritually. So Ellen White will talk about people who are butchers killing animals and how it affects their way they treat people. So it makes them more barbaric and aggressive, for instance. Just killing the animals in itself, that action. And I can see how that would be. So if you're in the army and you kill people, you've got a disrespect for human life, or if you kill animals, you've got disrespect for animal life. But she also talks about eating meat and how it makes us animalistic. Does it? I'm not sure. There's lots of people out there eating meat and they're not animalistic. They're not aggressive and horrible. They're not all aggressive and horrible. So there's an element of that which is very simple on one level. She's giving us some reasons in her mind at that time, or what God showed her, why not to eat meat. And I think we've moved on to what it is to say, okay, there's good scientific evidence, why not to eat meat? But I still wouldn't discount totally what she says. It affects the mind in some way. Perhaps we don't even understand that. So when I was New Age, so I'm not saying this is the truth, but when I was in New Age, we were taught not to eat meat because it will affect our karma, because those animals have a karma or an atmosphere. Now, whatever you believe those animals came from, we might believe it's your dead grandma that's come back as a cow, because that's what New Age teach, that you can be reincarnated as an animal. So then you might be affected by the karma of your grandfather or whatever. But that aside, so that may sound stupid, but the devil always twists the truth. So maybe there's something around that we carry atmosphere, it affects and how the person's blood, we know the life is in the blood, we know that if we eat contaminated blood from an animal, that we get sick. It's often the blood that makes people sick because it's full of diseases. It carries different things in it. So there is that, how something has lived and how it's conducted itself affects us when we eat it in that sense. So with that, we don't know our contact with human beings, the contact we have with them physically, mentally, emotionally, how that affects us. And we can see it on lots of levels, but we really don't know the depth of that. And I think it's foolish to think that it doesn't have an impact, because we see so many other stories where it does have an impact on the mind, the physical, the spiritual, and the mental. And I would say, with what sex does, and if you've not been in a committed marriage yet, and you haven't had that experience, you perhaps can't relate or know about it. And I can only go from my own experience, but I know what it does is it brings you in a closeness that you didn't have before, and it can do that through the marriage. So you can go through difficult patches, and you can have a time perhaps where you're not having sex. And I met a couple, I met a lady in the church, a couple of ladies, they were talking about sex, and they said, you can tell the couples that haven't had sex for a while because they're really niggling with each other. You know, they're getting irritated and they're getting upset with each other. And then they're different when you meet them next, and they were putting that down to having sex, and I thought they're just being silly. But in my relationship, I can say that when you have problems and difficulties, that brings you back together in a way that's like a recommitment. And what's the word? It incites, almost rekindles love if you've lost it. So that, and the problem with it is sometimes you withdraw physically because you're upset with each other, and so you don't want to do that. But when you do that, it actually brings you back together again. So I think there's something about it being a uniting factor. That a bit like when we get baptized and we commit to God, and then we have communion, which is a recommitment. So we don't get re-baptized, but every communion we have is a recommitment to God, it's a acknowledging the closeness that we're supposed to have with God. So we examine our hearts, see if there's anything between us. And to me, sex has that role. So it unites two people, not just physically, but spiritually, intellectually, and emotionally, in a way that is supernatural. It feels to me, and I'm careful to use the word supernatural, but spiritual. Let's say it's a spiritual experience, and you can't separate those things. So when you go then and have sex with someone outside of marriage, you're connecting with them physically, spiritually, and emotionally in a way that you don't even understand. And then once you stop now and they walk away, it's like you're getting a divorce. And I've spoken to people who've had that they've been in a sexual relationship, and to split that up now is really hard. And I'm sure if you've experienced that, you've been in the world, you've had sexual relationships, it's never non-damaging. It never not has, even though the men will do it and say, oh, I don't care, I'm not committed. Deep down, even if they say that, there's an emotional, spiritual connection with someone. And it's going to be hard to you long term to do that. So that would be I think it's God's mechanism for helping couples to have that closeness. So it's also, that's what we put over there, to have fun, but it's also to bring you, to unite you and keep you united, because marriage isn't easy. And we go through ups and downs and crises and challenges, just like you do in a Christian walk. And you have patches where you don't feel like you love each other, it's not there anymore, whatever. And there's something about that physical that should help to unite us. So it's not the only way, but it's one way. Okay, let's pray to close the session. Our dear loving God, we thank you that you are love and that the root of everything is love, that you want a relationship with each one of us and that you want us to have relationships with each other. We thank you for the relationships that you've given each one of us, whether it's friends, whether it's work colleagues, whether it's siblings or parents, or even marriage. We thank you for the privilege of being able to enjoy intimacy with people on emotional, physical and spiritual levels, and that we are threefold beings that can enjoy all those aspects. Please continue to guide us as we discuss these things on this Saturday. In Jesus' name. Amen.